It began quietly, no sirens, no shouting. Just a woman at a bus stop carrying her story in silence, and a system that saw her as a problem before a person. A small error became a reason, a stare became a decision, and suddenly her presence was treated like a threat. She didn't resist. She didn't plead. She stood there steady and unafraid, while the world tried to erase her without a sound. This isn't just a story about one arrest. It's about the quiet cruelty of being unseen, and the power of standing firm when no one stands with you. You're watching this now somewhere in your own corner of the world. What time is it where you are, and where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. It began with the low whine of tires pulling into gravel, a slow rumble swallowed by the night's heavy hush. Celeste Harmon stepped off the faded bus, with a quiet sigh, clutching her worn leather satchel close to her chest, as the door hissed shut behind her. The small rural terminal was nearly empty, lit by a handful of overhead fluorescents that flickered like tired stars, casting long shadows across the cracked tile floor. Outside, a cornfield stretched beyond the parking lot like a dark sea, and the only sound was the creaking of a rusted flagpole in the windless night. She paused at the threshold, breathing in air that tasted faintly of gasoline, old coffee, and something else, something she hadn't felt in decades. Unease. Her boots clicked softly as she walked to the ticket counter, the only movement in a space that seemed to have forgotten it once served people. A young man with curly blonde hair and a distracted look tapped idly at a keyboard, barely glancing up as she approached. "Evenin'," Celeste said, gently sliding her ticket and ID across the counter with practiced grace. "I think your scanner had trouble earlier, said there was some kind of mismatch on my name." The clerk squinted at the screen, then at her ID, then back again, frowning just a little deeper than before. His fingers hovered over the keys, hesitating. "Huh. Says, there's a flag. Some kind of hold on the name." He looked up, finally blinking. "Did you report anything stolen, ma'am? A wallet or something?" Celeste smiled politely, but felt her shoulders tighten beneath her coat. "No, sir. I haven't lost anything. That license is real, and it's been mine for 40 years. She tried to sound calm, tried not to let her voice carry the tremor of recognition. Something was off. Something wasn't just technical, it was personal, or maybe worse, systemic. She had seen this before, had studied the pattern, had taught the pattern to students too young to imagine it could still reach them. But it could, and now tonight it had reached her. Behind her a door opened with a dry metallic groan. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a tall figure in uniform stepping inside. The man was thick-shouldered, mid-50s, maybe with the kind of mustache that looked regulation even in retirement. He didn't say anything at first, just scanned the room with practiced indifference until his eyes landed on her. Something in his gaze didn't ask questions, it declared conclusions. Another figure followed behind, younger, slimmer, a woman whose wide eyes flicked between Celeste and the older man as if waiting for permission to speak. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice flat, almost bored, "I need to speak with you for a moment about a flagged identity report." Celeste folded her arms gently, the leather strap of her bag pressing into her ribs. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, not backing away but not moving forward either. He gestured toward a metal bench near the corner of the room. "You mind having a seat while we sort this out?" His tone wasn't aggressive, not yet, but it carried a weight she had no intention of ignoring. "I'd prefer to know exactly what you're sorting out first," she replied evenly. The younger deputy shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing down at the floor. The officer, his badge red, Rankin sighed, pulling a small tablet from his belt. "We've had issues with people using stolen credentials to board these late buses. Might just be a mix-up." He didn't sound like he believed it was a mix-up. Celeste nodded slowly, choosing her words with care. "Well, then I suppose it's a good thing I kept my receipts." She opened her bag carefully and pulled out a neatly folded packet, her travel itinerary, reservation confirmations, a notarized letter from her late sister's estate. Rankin barely glanced at it. "We'll need to verify some of this downtown," he said. "Just procedure." Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. "You're telling me you need to detain me for a database error without cause?" she asked. There was a silence between them, thick and sticky like humidity before a storm. Rankin didn't answer. He didn't have to. His body said everything this was happening, and she could either accept it quietly or make it harder. She looked past him through the plate glass windows, streaked with dust and condensation toward the fields where lightning bugs floated like lost stars. And for one fleeting second, she thought about her sister's voice, soft and certain, saying, "You don't come back home without a reason, girl. Places remember you." Celeste exhaled through her nose slowly. "All right," she said, finally, her voice low. "Then let's go." She stood on her own terms, straightened her coat, and walked toward the cruiser with long, steady steps. She didn't look back at the terminal, though she heard the young deputy whisper something like, "You sure this is necessary?" Rankin didn't reply. The cuffs were cold when they closed around her wrists, clinical, impersonal, a ritual of presumed guilt. As the car door slammed shut behind her, Celeste stared at the dashboard reflection in the window and thought, this isn't the first time someone mistook quiet for weakness. But it just might be the last time they get away with it. They brought her into the station just after midnight, a squat concrete building with peeling paint and flickering bulbs that buzzed overhead like they resented being awake. The interior smelled of old coffee, industrial cleaner, and the quiet fatigue of too many hours and not enough justice. As Celeste stepped inside, the cold air wrapped around her like a wet sheet, the linoleum floor sticky beneath her boots. Her breath caught slightly, not from fear, not yet, but from the quiet indignity of it all. No one greeted her. No one asked if she needed water or a phone call or even a chair. The only sounds were the steady tapping of a keyboard and the clatter of keys being tossed onto a metal desk. Deputy Rankin motioned her forward with a flick of his wrist already halfway through, filling out paperwork he hadn't even verified. "Name?" he asked, not looking up. "Celeste Harmon," she answered clearly, her voice even betraying none of the tremor building behind her ribs. "Age, 62. Reason for travel." She paused, but only for a second. "My sister passed. I'm here to bury her." The keyboard click stopped for a moment, not out of sympathy, just hesitation, like even the machine knew there were things it shouldn't reduce to data fields. "Sorry to hear that," the younger deputy, Kara, murmured almost too softly to register. Celeste gave her a glance, not unkind but firm. Sympathy without courage was just a quieter kind of silence. She was asked to remove her coat, her boots, her belt, her scarf, each item folded and placed into a plastic bin like they were evidence of a crime no one could define. Her fingers shook, but not from fear. From cold, maybe, or rage, or that deep ancestral exhaustion that lives in the bones of people who've been made to prove their innocence before they're allowed to speak. "Mind if we take a quick photo?" Rankin asked, already holding the camera. "You do what you're going to do," Celeste replied quietly. The flash was sudden and sharp, illuminating every line on her face, every hour she had worked, every year she had survived. For a split second, her image was captured, not as a professor, not as a widow, not even as a woman, but as a booking ID number flickering on a cracked monitor no one cared to clean. As they fingerprinted her, pressing each finger roughly onto the ink pad, Celeste kept her eyes on a water stain on the ceiling that looked like a spreading bruise. She counted the breaths between each roll of her fingers. 1, 2, 3. Trying not to flinch, not to wince, not to give them anything they could write down as non-compliance. "Do you always treat visitors like this?" she asked, her voice, still calm, but weighted now, like a stone dropped into still water. Rankin didn't answer. Kara looked away. The silence was an answer in itself. They led her down a narrow hallway to a holding cell with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet that looked like it hadn't been scrubbed since the Carter administration. The walls were pale yellow, but not the kind you'd find in a home, more like the yellow of neglect of things once meant to comfort that had curdled into something sterile and cold. When the door clanged shut behind her, it echoed with a kind of finality that went beyond steel. "We'll sort this out soon," Kara said quietly, standing just outside the bars. Celeste turned to her, her expression measured but tired. "Do you believe that?" she asked. Kara hesitated, then walked away without answering. Alone now, Celeste sat on the bench, with her hands resting in her lap, her posture deliberate, upright, dignified, refusing to let metal bars redefine who she was. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence, and every so often she could hear the low murmur of voices down the hall, laughter, a phone ringing, the lazy drawl of someone recounting a traffic stop like a bar story. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought of her sister's voice, soft and clear, reading scripture on the porch at dusk. She thought of her law students, of the ones who used to stay after class to ask if justice ever really changed anything. She used to tell them yes. Now she wasn't so sure. The minutes crawled. Her watch had been taken, but she could feel the hour deepen by the weight of it on her shoulders. Somewhere a door slammed. Somewhere else a man cursed. A printer whirred and stopped. The stillness pressed in tighter. Her wrists still carried the red impressions from the cuffs, faint but angry like a truth, trying to write itself onto her skin. She looked down at them and thought, this is what they want me to carry, the silence, the shame, the assumption that I have no one, that I am no one. But that's where they were wrong. She had built her life, brick by brick, law by law, knowing exactly how these systems worked because she had helped teach them. This wasn't just an arrest, it was an erasure attempt. And Celeste Harmon had never been one to vanish quietly. Somewhere in the distance a phone rang again. This time it didn't stop. She leaned back against the wall, exhaled through her nose, and whispered to the silence. You picked the wrong night and the wrong woman. The hours passed without ceremony, without kindness, without acknowledgement that a human being was sitting in that cold metal cell. The hum of the overhead lights had settled into a dull, almost hypnotic rhythm, like a machine that didn't know how to stop even when everyone inside the building had run out of purpose. Celeste sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her fingers gently pressing against the angry red impressions left by the handcuffs. She hadn't asked for a blanket. She hadn't asked for a glass of water. The very idea of asking for anything here felt like giving up something she had spent a lifetime protecting, her self-respect. The bench beneath her was unforgiving, its surface slick with cold, its edges biting into the backs of her thighs no matter how she shifted. The air smelled like disinfectant, but beneath that sterile mask was the lingering odor of sweat, rust, and time that never quite washed away. She watched a roach crawl along the far wall and disappear behind a chipped baseboard, and for a long moment that little creature felt more human than the officers who had processed her. Somewhere down the hallway, someone laughed, short, sharp, a barking sound that made her flinch, not because it was loud, but because it was so casual, so comfortable, as if nothing unjust had happened tonight. She leaned her head back and let her eyes close just for a minute, and the memories came rushing in like smoke under a door. She was 23 again, standing in front of a classroom full of young white men who didn't believe she belonged at the front of the lecture hall. She remembered how they leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, waiting for her to slip up. She remembered the sting of her mother's voice when she said, "You can't ever afford to be tired, not in this skin." And she remembered Marcus, her late husband, being dragged out of their car in a traffic stop gone wrong, even after flashing his judicial ID, even after explaining who he was. Especially after explaining who he was. "I know how this plays out," she whispered to the silence, her voice barely audible, more for herself than anyone else. "They file the report, bury the footage, call it a misunderstanding, and I go home with bruises and an apology." She opened her eyes again, let the flickering ceiling light come back into focus. Not this time, she added more clearly now. Not like this. At the end of the hallway, she heard footsteps, measured, deliberate, and then the low squeak of a radio being adjusted on a belt. The younger deputy, Kara, appeared a moment later, hesitating just outside the bars, holding something in her hands that looked like a clipboard, but felt heavier somehow. "Miss Harmon," she said, not meeting her eyes there. "Still verifying your information. Might be a while." Celeste didn't answer right away. She studied the woman's posture, the way her fingers gripped the clipboard, how her shoulders pulled inward slightly, like armor worn too long. "How long have you been working here?" Celeste asked, her voice soft but steady. Kara blinked, caught off guard. 2 years, she said quickly. "Straight out of the academy." Celeste gave a slow nod. "And in 2 years, how many people have you seen in this cell who didn't belong here?" Kara looked down. The silence stretched. "More than I want to admit," she said finally. Celeste tilted her head slightly, her gaze calm but unrelenting. "Then why are you still standing on that side of the bar?" Kara opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps quicker, now sharper against the linoleum. Celeste exhaled, not in anger, but in the sad, familiar recognition that most people didn't choose cruelty, they just failed to interrupt it. She shifted slightly on the bench, rolled her neck slowly, and stared at the peeling paint on the ceiling again. It reminded her of an old courtroom in Memphis she'd once testified in, where the windows were too high, and the judge never once looked her in the eye. She thought of the students she had mentored, of the ones who stayed behind after class with questions about justice, not law. She thought of Marina, her brightest student, who used to sit in the front row taking notes, like every word was a key to something locked. Marina had gone on to the DOJ last she heard. A rising star, someone who still believed the system could be forced to serve those it was built to forget. Celeste smiled faintly at the thought, not because it gave her hope, but because it reminded her that some lessons had roots even if you never saw them bloom. The door at the far end of the hall opened again. She didn't look up this time. She didn't need to. She just whispered quietly, "You better be watching, Marina. It's your turn now." Then she folded her hands again and waited. Not for mercy, not for forgiveness, but for the sound of a phone ringing somewhere beyond these walls, the sound of the reckoning beginning. The call came in just after 2:17 a.m., long after the lights had dimmed in the DOJ's regional field office and most of the staff had gone home. Marina Lopez was still at her desk, hunched over a stack of civil suit filings, when her screen lit up with a familiar face frozen mid-blink on a grainy thumbnail video. Local news footage from a rural county station tagged with the words, "Disturbance at bus depot leads to arrest." She clicked the link out of habit, expecting another drunk and disorderly, or maybe a small-town scuffle, but the moment the video began to play, her entire body stiffened like someone had just dropped a cold hand down her spine. There in the frame, surrounded by officers, arms stiff at her sides, and dignity intact like a steel beam buried under stone, stood Celeste Harmon, her mentor, her former professor, her guiding light through the thorns of justice. The footage wasn't long, maybe 30 seconds, but it showed enough Celeste being cuffed beside a flickering vending machine, her words inaudible but her expression clear, measured, calm, deeply offended and unshaken. Marina didn't blink until the screen faded to black. She reached for her phone, her voice already steady despite the adrenaline pooling in her chest. "Get me Davis in field ops," she said, and before the intern on night duty could stammer a response, she added, "Tell him we may have a live civil rights violation in progress, and it's personal." While the agents began mobilizing from their respective districts, Marina opened a separate secure line and dialed a private number she hadn't used in nearly 3 years. When the voicemail picked up after 2 rings, she left a single message. "She's in trouble. It's happening again. I'm on it." She didn't need to sign her name. If he was still the man she remembered, he'd know exactly who and what she meant. Back at the station, Celeste hadn't moved. Her eyes remained steady, her breathing slow, her body folded inward like a letter sealed shut, nothing leaking, nothing wasted. But she could feel the change coming in the air, in the sudden hush that passed through the hallway, like a shift in barometric pressure before a storm. Footsteps had quickened, voices had lowered, and something about the way Deputy Kara Dwyer kept glancing toward the front desk told her that the night was no longer under their control. It began subtly. A phone rang, not the shrill station line, but a secure one, low and direct, the kind they weren't used to answering. Then another, and another. The sergeant at the front, a thick-set man with a permanent scowl and ink-stained fingers, answered the first with a grunt, but ended the call, standing upright posture, suddenly alert, his eyes flicking toward the holding cells like he was being watched from behind a two-way mirror. "You sure that name's right?" he muttered to no one in particular, then added under his breath, "God help us." A few minutes later, Marina walked through the front door of the station, like a quiet blade being drawn from a sheath. Her suit was immaculate, her heels clicking against the stained linoleum, like a metronome keeping time in a room full of static. 2 agents followed close behind, not saying a word, their earpieces tucked beneath dark hair and clipped speech. The room paused, phones frozen mid-air, coffee cups suspended halfway to mouths, everyone turning without knowing why. "I'm here for Celeste Harmon." Marina said, not raising her voice, but not needing to. She held out her badge without ceremony. "You've made a serious mistake. I suggest you fix it before you make a bigger one." Kara was the first to react. She moved toward the holding cell and unlocked the door without being told, the keys trembling slightly in her hand as she pushed it open. "Miss Harmon," she said quietly, "you're free to go." Celeste stood slowly, her joints stiff from hours of stillness, her face expressionless. "What changed?" she asked. Kara glanced over her shoulder toward Marina, then looked down. "Everything," she whispered. Celeste stepped out of the cell without hesitation, her eyes scanning the room but not resting on anyone for more than a second. Then her gaze met Marina's, and something in her spine relaxed. Not quite gratitude, but recognition, a private reunion sealed in a single nod. "You remembered," Celeste said softly. Every word Marina replied, her voice carrying both reverence and resolve. Together they walked past the officers who had laughed, who had judged, who now stood silent as their world bent slowly out of shape. No one dared speak. Outside, the air had shifted. The horizon glowed faintly with the earliest streaks of morning light, and in that strange hour between night and dawn, Celeste inhaled deeply, not for strength, but for confirmation that someone had finally come when it mattered, and that someone had once sat in the front rows scribbling notes about justice with wide eyes, and a question no one dared to answer aloud. What happens when the system turns on the very people who built it? Now the answer was walking out the front door, two women side by side, a quiet revolution wrapped in wool coats and burning eyes, carrying no flags, offering no speeches, but bringing with them the one thing that frightened the system most, a truth backed by power. And it had only just begun. The air inside the station had shifted into something heavier, something almost physical, like the thickness that settles before a thunderstorm that no one wants to admit is coming. Celeste stood near the front desk, her back straight, her eyes calm, her hands no longer bound but still carrying the weight of what had just been done. Around her the officers moved with rehearsed casualness, pretending to sip coffee, pretending to sort files, pretending they weren't watching the DOJ agents fanning out through their station like a quiet flood. No one spoke above a whisper anymore. The mood had cracked, and everyone inside knew it, even the ones still clinging to their clipboards and chain-of-command bravado. Marina didn't need to raise her voice to get what she wanted. She simply gestured, and doors were opened. Computers were logged into. Footage was requested, and then demanded when the first requests went unanswered. "We're not here to play cleanup," she said evenly to the precinct captain whose face had paled 2 full shades since she walked in. "We're here to see what happens when no one thinks they're being watched." Her tone wasn't angry, it was worse, controlled, surgical, like she had already seen this a dozen times before and knew exactly how deep to cut. Celeste said nothing. She stood to the side, watching, as the machine she once taught others to navigate began to turn on itself. The walls echoed faintly with printer noises, clipped phone calls, and the scratch of pens signing things people didn't read. But beneath all of it was something else, something more human. The sound of realization, the sound of fear. Not the loud kind, but the quiet one that creeps into your gut when the old rules stop working and the people you assumed were powerless start showing up in suits holding federal jurisdiction like a loaded weapon. Officer Rankin tried to push back. "You can't just seize our property," he barked, stepping toward the tech agent downloading hard drives near the evidence room. Marina didn't even look at him. "Actually," she said without turning her head, "I can. Section 242, Title 18. You should brush up." Rankin opened his mouth again, but the words stalled before they could form. His hands were twitching now, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. He was no longer in control. And that truth, simple and sudden, hit harder than any shout or shove could have. The younger deputy, Kara, hovered near the hallway, her arms folded, eyes darting between her colleagues and the agents. She looked like someone standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether she was being pushed or asked to jump. Celeste caught her eye for a brief moment, not accusatory, not forgiving, just recognition. A silent question passed between them. "Are you ready to tell the truth, or do you still think silence will protect you?" Kara looked away, but only after a second too long. Then came the footage. The agent at the central terminal pulled it up and turned the monitor so that all could see. No edits, no missing timestamps, no flickering frames. Just the truth laid bare in digital clarity. Celeste at the pharmacy. Celeste showing her ID, her paperwork, her prescription. Calm. Respectful. Composed. then Rankin stepping in. Then the dismissal of evidence. Then the handcuffs. Then the smirk. Not one moment of resistance, not one threat, just dignity forcibly dragged through bureaucracy. No one spoke as the clip ended. Even the printer stopped humming as if machines too had shame. Celeste didn't react. She didn't need to. She had lived it. She didn't have to perform for an audience that had already failed her. Marina turned slowly to the precinct captain. "That's enough for today," she said quietly. "We'll be following up with the city attorney and filing federal charges pending review of the complete case files. You'll hear from our office within 48 hours. Rankin stepped forward again, this time slower, his voice lower. "She could have just walked away," he muttered, like a man still trying to find the exit from a room that no longer had a door. Celeste finally turned to him, her voice so steady it barely disturbed the air. "Walk away from what?" she asked. "My name, my rights, my sister's funeral." He opened his mouth but couldn't answer. She nodded once. "That's what I thought." As she and Marina made their way toward the exit, the silence in the room turned into something sacred, almost reverent. The agents flanked them not as protection but as proof that someone had come, that someone had listened, that someone had finally said, "This ends here." Celeste didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift behind her, the unraveling of something that had been too tightly wound for too long. And as the morning sun began to press against the glass of the front windows, spilling golden light across the floor like a verdict, she allowed herself a small breath of something dangerously close to peace. It wasn't justice yet, not fully, but it was something, a beginning, a breach in the silence, and for Celeste Harmon that was enough for now. By the time the press conference began, the room was already filled, to capacity a thick knot of cameras, microphones, reporters, city officials, and distant stares. The walls of the municipal building seemed to lean inward heavy with the weight of what was about to be said, and Celeste could feel every breath in the room, could hear the low murmur of voices tapering off like a tide pulling back before it crashed forward. She sat in the second row, flanked by Marina and two civil rights attorneys from the DOJ, their expressions unreadable, their suit collars damp from sweat despite the blasting air conditioning. The podium stood beneath a county seal that had never meant much to her, not really, but today it trembled under the spotlight like it had something to prove. The mayor was first to speak, clearing his throat into the mic, with a nervous cough that sounded louder than it should have. "We're here today to acknowledge what cannot be ignored any longer," he began, his voice shaky, but rehearsed each word strung together like a fence built in a hurry. The wrongful detainment of Miss Celeste Harmon was not just an isolated mistake, it was a symptom of a broader failure. He paused, glanced nervously to his right, then continued. "Effective immediately, the officers involved have been suspended, and an independent review of the precinct will begin within the week." Cameras clicked like teeth. A few scattered murmurs rippled through the crowd, half approval, half disbelief. Celeste didn't move. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her spine tall, her breath steady. These were words she had heard before in classrooms and hearings, in the mouths of people who often meant well but changed little. She waited not for apologies but for the moment when the room would truly shift, when someone would finally say what needed to be said without dodging the truth behind politics and public relations. That moment came when Marina stood uninvited and walked to the mic. Her voice was quieter than the mayor's, but somehow more commanding, like the center of gravity had suddenly relocated. "What happened to Miss Harmon is not new," she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd without blinking. "It's not rare and it's not over. It is the result of a system that too often confuses authority with righteousness and suspicion with justification." She paused, then added, "But this time the system didn't get away with it, and it won't next time either." Outside beyond the doors, a growing crowd had gathered, neighbors, students, veterans, nurses in scrubs, holding hand-painted signs, church leaders, even a few off-duty officers who stood with arms crossed but eyes open. They weren't protesting exactly, they were bearing witness to the apology, to the reckoning, to the fact that someone like Celeste had refused to shrink and in doing so had forced an entire town to look in the mirror a little longer than it was comfortable with. Later that week, the lawsuit was filed thick, detailed, signed by over 30 plaintiffs whose names had waited in silence for far too long. Men and women, black, brown, poor, old, all of them marked by some past encounter that no one had believed or bothered to write down. But now it was official. Now it was public record. Now the stories had a name to stand behind. Harmon v. County of Denton. Celeste's name typed in bold on the front page, but carried by all of them. Her phone didn't stop ringing after that. Invitations from media outlets, civil rights organizations, university panels. Some wanted her to speak. Others wanted her to lead. But most, she realized, just wanted to say thank you, to whisper into her voicemail, or write into her inbox. You reminded me I'm not crazy. I'm not alone. And maybe I'm not invisible after all. Still, there were nights when the weight of it all pressed against her chest like a storm door in the wind. Nights when she sat at the edge of her bed, bare feet on the cool floor, and wondered what would have happened if Marina hadn't picked up the phone, if the video hadn't been recorded, if no one had believed her. But then she'd remember that even if none of those things had happened, she still wouldn't have given up because there were too many people who couldn't afford for her to. One Sunday afternoon, months after it all began, Celeste stood in front of a small gathering at the courthouse steps. It wasn't a rally. It wasn't televised. Just a quiet gathering of people who'd come to say, "We're still here." She wore a simple gray dress, her sister's silver brooch pinned near her collarbone, her voice even and low as she spoke. "Justice," she said slowly, "is not a destination. It's a series of footsteps taken by people who refuse to stay still." Someone in the crowd nodded. Someone else wiped their eyes. And when she stepped down, Marina met her at the edge of the steps, holding out a folded piece of paper. "From D.C., she said. "They want you to consult with the federal task force. Help design national reform guidelines. Help shape what comes next." Celeste looked at the paper, then at the people around her, then at the courthouse doors behind her. "I'll do it," she said after a long pause, "but only if we start with the places no one wants to look." That evening, as she walked home through streets that finally started to feel familiar again, children played along the sidewalks and wind rustled through the sycamores that lined her block. A neighbor called her name and waved. Someone honked their horn and shouted, "We got your back, Miss Harmon." She smiled, not because it was over, but because it was different now. Because something had shifted, not just in the policy, not just in the headlines, but in the way people looked at each other. A little longer, a little deeper. Like they had remembered something ancient and necessary, that dignity is not a gift from power, it's a right we're all born with. And sometimes all it takes is one woman refusing to sit down for everyone else to remember they've been standing all along. What happened to Celeste Harmon wasn't just one bad night, it was a mirror held up to a system far too comfortable with silence. It reminded us that even when you play by the rules, speak calmly, and carry yourself with dignity, you can still be treated like you don't belong simply because of who you are. But it also showed us something else, that dignity doesn't break easily, especially when it's built on years of endurance, courage, and knowing exactly who you are. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight back with fists. She stood, she waited, and when the moment came, she answered injustice. Not with rage, but with truth, with law, and with the kind of quiet strength that shakes walls. This story is a reminder, especially for those of us who have seen decades come and go, that the fight for justice doesn't end with retirement or age or grief. It continues in every courtroom, every vote, every letter written, and every time we speak up when it would be easier to look away. We carry the memory of those who couldn't speak for themselves, and we light the path for those still learning how. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you once were, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that honor courage, resilience, and the kind of everyday dignity that changes the world one quiet stand at a time.